So here we are on day 8 of our Scarlet Letter unit, and we're finished with the novel. But what we're going to do for the next 2 days is we're going to read some short stories, some famous short stories. Today's reading is The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Edgar Allan Poe is a name that most every student should know. You should probably have been reading his stuff since elementary school, starting with the easier stuff like The Telltale Heart or The Black Cat, and then progressing up to things like The Raven and Annabel Lee, some of his poetry. And then when you get to be a high schooler, you tackle the big one, Mask of the Red Death, which we may do later this summer, and then especially Fall of the House of Usher, which is what we're going to do today. Fall of the House of Usher is a very dense read. It has a lot of large vocab words that you're probably unfamiliar with, and you were supposed to tackle it, and I hope you did, and you should see what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to sit and try to read it to you because that's going to be tough. So what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you who Edgar Allan Poe was, and then we're going to go over another presentation about the thoughts in Fall of the House of Usher, and then we'll do our reading. All right, so before we get into the reading of The Fall of the House of Usher, I need to make sure that you understand who Edgar Allan Poe was and maybe some of the connections as far as the literary genre and the period that he wrote in, corresponding with Nathaniel Hawthorne. They were actually friends, and they kind of wrote similar. They wrote similar stories. All right, so Gothic versus Romanticism. Romanticism developed as a reaction against the rationalism of the Age of Reason. Romantic freed the imagination from the hold of reason so they could follow their imagination wherever it might lead. For Romantic writers, the imagination led to the threshold of the unknown, the shadowy region where the fantastic, the demonic, and the insane reside. While the Gothics saw the individual, they saw the potential for evil. Down here, Romantic writers celebrated the beauty of nature. Gothic writers were peering into the darkness at the supernatural. So it's kind of a light, dark contrast in the same kind of genre. Gothic movement in America. The Gothic tradition was firmly established in Europe before American writers had made name for themselves. By the 19th century, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and to a lesser extent, Washington Irving and Herman Melville were using the Gothic elements in their writing. Edgar Allan Poe was the master of the Gothic form in the United States. Poe. His stories have settings that feature dark medieval castles and decaying ancient estates, such as The Fall of the House of Usher. He has characters that are male and insane, and female who are beautiful and dead or dying, such as the Cask of Amontillado and the Raven. Plots that include murder, live burials, physical and mental torture, retribution from beyond the grave, which is Cask of Amontillado, the Pendulum, and the Telltale Heart. In junior high school, you should have read the Telltale Heart at least. Cask of Amontillado is something that I teach in high school, and we may or may not have a Poe unit later this summer. The Gothic dimension of Poe's fictional world offered him a way to explore the human mind in these extreme situations and so arrive at an essential truth. Hawthorne, who we just finished reading his Scarlet Letter, also used Gothic elements in his work to express what he felt were essential truths. Instead of looking at the mind for its dysfunction, Hawthorne examined the human heart under conditions of fear, vanity, mistrust, and betrayal, guilt, hypocrisy, all of those things, like we saw in Scarlet Letter, and with Roger Chillingworth in Scarlet Letter. All right, so here's Mr. Poe. During a life marked by pain and loss, Poe wrote haunting tales in which he explored the dark side of the human mind. He was a well-read man with a taste for literature. Poe was cursed with a morbidly sensitive nature and made his feelings of sadness and depression the basis of a distinctive body of literary work. The following is a look at the life and work of this mysterious American master. Poe is probably, without a doubt, one of the most famous names in American literature. He was born here in 1809. Poe published his first work. Then he got expelled from West Point because he didn't like taking orders from people and he had different sensibilities. Got married. Then here, Poe published tales of grotesque and arabesque, including The Fall of the House of Usher. So he wrote this in 1839. Poe wrote The Murders of the Rue Morgue. Poe's most famous work, without a doubt, is The Raven, which he published in 1845. And 2 years later, he died in Baltimore. We're going to go into detail about the themes, the imagery, and all of that in The Fall of the House of Usher. And this is how I'm going to address the work before we move on to the answers for the common lit. All right, so I skipped over a little bit in this presentation because it's stuff that I've already touched on with Romanticism and Gothic literature and all that. So here we are. This is an example of what the house may have looked at in The Fall of House of Usher. There's tons of descriptions in the opening couple of pages about how it was a scary place. You could just think of, any old-timey movies or Scooby-Doo cartoons or anything like that. The castle where it's dark and there's fog and etc. And then it talks about this like lake, this pond-like thing that's just gross and disgusting, and it feels like just a place of death and despair. All right, so elements of Gothic writing, emphasis on setting, which is the exterior and the interior of the landscape and the houses. We touch on this both in this story, how the description is of the outside and the inside of the house. Castle-like architecture. Characters are brooding and secretive. They have buried family secrets, trying to keep their secrets hidden. Long history of family tied to a certain place. The doubling motif. In literary criticism, this is called a doppelganger, from the German for double goer. Examples are Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Secret Share by Joseph Conrad. What function does the doppelganger motif serve? Well, basically, it represents the dual nature of man. In Poe, one side of man is reason, on the other mind. The other is emotion of the body. All right, and Roderick and Madeline, these are the Ushers. Roderick Usher, Madeline Usher are genetic twins, but psychologically they are also doubles. They're extremely close. So who represents what in this story? Roderick is an artist. He has nervous agitation. He lives in a dark upstairs apartment with cadaverous complexion, means he's very thin and pale. Want of moral energy, and he's excessive nervous agitation. Roderick's mental condition is affected by his environment. Here's a line. He was enchanted by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted. An effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down had at length brought about the moral of his existence. See what I'm saying? This is dense reading. Here, physique refers to something physical, and morale refers to something mental. Roderick is all mind in a weak body. He represents in one way the life of the isolated artist through his paintings, readings, and his guitar playing. Madeline has a debilitating illness. All descriptions focus on the body. It's described gradual wasting away of the person. Roderick and the narrator screw down the lid of her coffin. You should know what have happened by now. She returns from the tomb to reclaim her twin brother, her double. The huge antique panels threw back. She fell heavily inward upon her brother and bore him to the floor a corpse. So what's Poe's point? Poe addresses the dual and conflicted nature of the self in this story. Mind and body are at war with each other, as they are in each of us. We try to repress one side and live without it. Think about Dimsdale. But we cannot achieve a harmonious existence in this way. The function of the setting, the exterior. Let's talk about the outside of the House of Usher. It has two meanings. The physical dwelling, as well as the family line or lineage. The entire family lay in the direct line of descent. The house is a type of character in the story. Like the family, it is of an excessive antiquity. The landscape is overgrown and ragged. On the front down, the middle is a barely perceptible fissure going in a zigzag direction. There is a crack in the foundation of the house, just like there is a crack in the foundation of the family. The family and the house, Madeline and Roderick, and the actual house itself they're mirror images of one another. Okay, so a metaphorical fissure in the family, an actual fissure in the house. Interior. with the Gothic architecture. Windows were long, narrow, and pointed, feeble gleams of encrimsoned light, dark draperies, an atmosphere of sorrow. Poe's language is extremely lyrical. Now, I told you that a lot of writers don't write this way anymore. The closest thing you'll get is like a Cormac McCarthy. Uh, it's a beautiful writing, if you ask me. It's almost like poetry in prose form. But we write in a much easier to read level now. Roderick lives upstairs, which is the mind. Madeline is entombed below, which is the body. Structure unity. So Poe creates text within text. The haunted palace reflects the Usher family in the house. The mad tryst parallels Madeline's return from the grave. The storm outside is analogous to the turmoil inside the characters in the house, and the book titles in Roderick's library are symbolic of the themes of the story. See, if you read it, how deep and dense the text is. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over the answers, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And I'm not going to read it to you. I've gone over it enough, and you should have read it. But what I do want to do is I do want to talk about this last paragraph, because this is an extremely well-written paragraph. And at this point, Madeline has returned to reclaim Roderick, and there's a huge storm, and it's just like a big to-do. And the narrator is just trying to run away and trying to get away from it. And so he's trying to get out of the house. And so we're going to start right here at the top of this paragraph. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad, and all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I have spoken before, as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters, in the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. I love that paragraph. It's just a perfect summation, and it's mirror image. I mean, it's symmetry with the very first opening paragraph. So the house collapses, and the Usher family collapses within it. Both house and family, both houses, gone. All right, here we go. Let me see here. All right, number one, reread the introduction of the story. How does the imagery depicted in the beginning of the story contribute to or set up the story? Consider what the house symbolizes. Well, there is a ton of imagery in everything that Poe writes. And, you know, this is just your opinion. I like windows. It sets up the sentence of the manor, the symbolic connection between the house and the people. It almost has a life of its own, as does the description of the fissure and of the tarn and the moat and all that. All right, number two, the answer is D. Which of the following best identifies the theme of the text? Decay of the aristocracy. Aristocracy is rich people, old rich men, old money. As we did Gatsby, Tom, and those like that before him. Part A. Number three, what does the word similitude most likely mean? This is how you answer. This is how they ask you vocab questions. The answer is B. Number four, which phrase from the paragraph best supports the answer to part A? The answer is C. Number five, which of the following statements best summarizes the relationship between the family and literal House of Usher? The answer is C. Number six, what are the reactions to Sir Lancelot's mad tryst reveal about the narrators and Roderick's different points of views of the message? The answer is A. And number seven, the Fall of the House of Usher. Poe includes a set of verses written by Roderick. How does this poem contribute to the story's theme? Do they share similarities? Well, Uh, yes, it adds to the overall piece. First half of the verses describes this idyllic kingdom, this Camelot, ruled by this wise king. But evil comes in, conquers the kingdom, destroys everything. This is very similar to what's happening with the ushers themselves. Number 8, but instead of evil, it's madness and distrust. Number 8, the answer is C. How are the details of Roderick and Madeline's illness important to the development of the plot? Madeline's cataleptic condition leads to her early burial, while Roderick's heightened senses force him to hear her struggles to break out of the tomb, driving him mad. All right, these are yours. What was ultimately responsible for the fall of the House of Usher? In the context of this story, how do people face death? Number 3, in the context of the story, how does fear drive action? Those are up to you to answer of your own opinion. So that's the fall of the House of Usher. What do you think? Very dense, I know, but it's a very famous piece of literature. It's a horror story almost. I've had students read it and they tell me they think Madeline is a vampire and all that, which is awesome. I love that. It's just a good, scary story that I like to teach. Anyway, think about how that related to Dimmesdale. How are the characters of the narrator, and no, not the narrator. How are Roderick and Dimmesdale similar? What are some of the ideas, the themes? Why do you think Hawthorne and Poe were friends? Very similar in their writing and their uses of trying to maybe even take parables to reach a bigger, to teach you something. All right, we have one more reading for the Scarlet Letter unit. It is Young Goodman Brown, which was also written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So just like today, I'm not going to sit and read it because it's, again, a long story and it is dense. It's not as dense as Fall of the House of Usher, but it's still, it's a little harder to read than Scarlet Letter. So we're going to talk one more presentation on who Hawthorne was, talk a little bit about the story, have a PowerPoint presentation on the things you need to know from Young Goodman Brown, and then we'll read, and that'll be it. Last day on Friday will be my thoughts on Scarlet Letter. So until I see you again, it's a great day to be a warrior.